Hello Year 4, in history today we will be beginning our new topic of the Anglo Saxons. Today we will be looking at the Anglo Saxons, who they were and where they came from. To start with, I have some retrieval questions for you. I've got two here that I would like you to pause the video and have a think about. Off you go. Okay then, so number one, name one reason why the Romans left Britain. We know, don't we, from last term that there was four main reasons why the Romans left Britain. So let's see if you've got any of these down. One reason that the Romans left Britain is because their empire grew too big and it actually became quite difficult for them to govern, which means control. Another reason is because the power of their empire relied on how successful the army were. And we know that the success of the army did weaken, which meant the empire did collapse. A third reason is that they spent quite a lot of their money on the army, the military, and that left little money left for anything else in the empire, so their economy fell. And a final reason, we know that Rome's enemies became stronger, and that's why Britain was invaded by the Anglo Saxons and the Picts. The second question was, who settled in England when the Romans left? A, the Picts, B, the Angles and Saxons, and C, the Romans. The answer is, in fact, B, the Angles and Saxons. Now, you might not have heard them like that before, but we're going to speak a little bit about where they came from, so you'll learn why they were called the Angles and the Saxons today. To start with, sometimes you might see years written like 2000 AD or 550 BC. What does AD and BC mean? Can you remember? Pause the video and have a think. AD means after Jesus was born. So if you see 2000 AD, it almost means that was the year 2000 years after Jesus was born. And AD comes from this Latin word Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. BC is before Jesus was born, like before Christ. So if you see 550 BC, it means 550 years before Jesus was born. This timeline here shows when the Anglo-Saxons lived in Britain, and we can see here, in this blue shade here, that they were in Britain between 410 and 790. However, one of the labels is missing. Can you remember who lived in Britain before the Anglo-Saxons arrived? That's right, it was the Romans, and they successfully invaded Britain in 43 AD and they stayed until 410. Now, I know you know lots about the Romans in Britain, so if you would like to pause the video, have a chat if there's someone sitting next to you, or just have a bit of a refresh in your head. What do you know about the Romans in Britain? Pause the video and off you go. You might have found out lots about the Romans. We did find out lots, and hopefully you've remembered lots too. The Romans had a huge empire that stretched across most of Europe, parts of Asia, and parts of North Africa. They were very well organised, and they had a very powerful army. And what would happen with the Roman army would invade and conquer a new land. And governors would then be put in charge of making sure that the people in that land followed the laws of Rome. And that's what happened in Britain. Before the Romans came to Britain, there were no schools, no roads, and no large cities. We know, don't we, that how many main roads were in a Roman town? Well done, super job. The people who had lived in England before the Romans were called the Celts, and we know they lived in small farming communities. Now on this slide, I've got one picture of a Celtic roundhouse and a picture of a Roman villa. I want you to pause the video and have a think. What can you see that is similar about the roundhouse and the villa? And what can you see that is different about the two? Pause the video and have a think and a bit of a chat if there's someone to talk to next to you. Well done, I bet you had lots of fantastic discussion there. Now, this is where we said goodbye to the Romans, wasn't it? Now what happened is there were lots and lots of attacks in Britain from the Picts, the Scots and the Saxons. And by around 410 AD, the Romans had left Britain to go and defend their home back home because they were under increasing threat from other people who were trying to invade them. But this meant that in Britain there were no Romans anymore, and it was left on its own for the first time in about 400 years. There was no one to control Britain anymore, and the British were not prepared to fight. What do you think might have happened next? Now Britain has been left alone, there's no one ruling it, the Romans have gone back to where they came from, their home territory. What do you think might happen next? Have a think. Let's have a look. Now, when the Romans did leave Britain to go home, this was around 410 AD. The people who were left behind, they started fighting because they wanted to be the one who would take control of this new abandoned land. Okay? And this period is known as the Dark Age because this is where there was not much progress in Britain and it was left on its own, and people were fighting to see who would be in control of Britain next. By 410 AD, the Roman Empire was falling apart. In Britain, the Romans who were still there were being attacked, and these people that were attacking them came from Germany, and we need to try and remember that. There were two groups of people that came from Germany, and these were called the Angles and the Saxons. And what would happen is they'd sail over from Germany in their ships, attack the big Roman houses, steal their valuables and their people, and then they would sail back to Germany. Do you think that is fair? Have a think. In 410 AD, the Roman governor of Britain, so remember they had governors of every part of the land, asked Rome to send this Roman army to help fight the Angles and the Saxons. So they'd have a little bit of support there because the people in Britain couldn't do it themselves. And the Roman emperor said, no, we will not send the Roman army back to help defend your territory. And the Roman emperor said no, so now Britain was not protected anymore. And the Angles and Saxons saw this as a great opportunity to stop going home, because we know they'd sail over from Germany, steal their valuables, steal their people, come back to Germany, sail over the sea, but this time they stopped doing that because they knew that no one would try and stop them. So they started to live in Britain. And this is when the Angles and the Saxons, the two groups, joined together to become the Anglo Saxons. And that's where they came from. And they started to live in Britain. They spoke Anglish, so we speak English, but they spoke Anglish, and they also called the country they now lived in Angland rather than England. And these words are English and England that we use today, so that's where our words came from. That's quite interesting. Now, some of the Roman people went back to Rome, but some of them stayed in Britain and learned the new way that the Anglo-Saxons did things. And what happened was there were three groups of people. We already know about the Angles and Saxons who were from Germany and that they sailed over to settle in England. But there was also a third group of people, and they were called the Jutes. And we could see that the Jutes, the Angles and the Saxons, came from Germany and they sailed to different parts. The Roman Britons were pushed north or west, and we can see that the Picts and the Scots now live in Scotland. Now, the Romans had never managed to conquer Scotland in the north, and these tribes lived as they'd always done, because they often wanted to fight each other and raid other parts of Britain. And we know that, don't we? Because we know the Romans tried to build a wall. Do you remember what that wall was called? Hadrian's Wall, well done. And that was to stop the Picts from getting in, because they would often try and fight each other. So the Romans could never control the Picts, and they still can't now. Now, the Jutes settled mainly in a place called Kent, and they called themselves the Kentings, and that means the men living in Kent. The Angles settled in East Anglia, which is a place. The Saxons settled in areas of Essex, and that is where the East Saxons settled. Sussex, where the South Saxons settled. Middlesex, where the Middle Saxons settled. And Wessex, where the West Saxons settled. So we can see there were four groups of Saxons, the East, the South, the Middle and the West, who all settled in different areas. And that's where the areas got their names from too, which we'll be learning a little bit more about later. I want you to have a think. What problems do you think the Anglo Saxons might have faced when they first started settling in Britain? Pause the video and have a think. You've came up with lots of brilliant ideas there.